As you are very aware of, internet shutdowns have been growing in different parts of Africa, and today we just want to look at some of the consequences of that and just engage in a discussion regarding this very important topic. So let's look a little bit about look at the digital revolution. We know when in the late 90s and early 2000, when the digital revolution raised hopes of democracy and of innovation and transformation in Africa, there was a lot of optimism about what technology can do for Africa as a nation in terms of democracy, in terms of innovation, in terms of business growth. We can see that indeed in those areas we have made some progress. Social media have enabled a lot of innovation, as you know, of like the mobile money transfer technology that started out in East Africa and have grown in different other parts of Africa. So there's so many good examples that we can look at of how technology has promoted business, communication, citizen participation in democracy. Social media has also empowered critics, human rights activists. There's a lot that used to happen in the dark that we can now see on social media. We can have, real-time information on some of the things that are happening in different parts of the continent and in the world. As right now, we might be based in different countries, but we all are aware of the large protests that are taking place in Nigeria right now. So those are some of the ways in which social media has given citizens a platform to make their voices heard. Despite all the positive that we have seen, we need to acknowledge the challenges that we are still facing right now in Africa when it comes to digital democracy and internet penetration. There's a very poor internet penetration in Africa. Africa is about 1.2 billion people, but less than half those people have access to internet. There's a major digital divide right now. We have issues of digital access and inclusion. The poorest part of the population who don't have access to internet, especially when you move to some remote places in villages and some of the areas where internet still need to reach. We are also seeing social media attacks in certain countries, Uganda, for instance, Benin, and several other countries that have imposed a social media tax. In Tanzania, we also see the government implemented restrictive laws about what can be said online. So many of these limitations and restrictions are really posing a problem, especially given that already a large part of the population in Africa still doesn't have access to internet. But what we want to talk about today is internet shutdowns. And we are seeing that especially during during very crucial moments in our democracy. And we are going to get into a bit more detail. So as I said, while the growing internet coverage has enabled citizens to challenge authoritarian rule, non-democratic leaders are using the internet and manipulating internet and disrupting online access. So internet shutdowns have become like a new normal in some authoritarian states, especially during political contested period, during elections, during protests. We are seeing governments using those moments when citizens are coming together to stifle freedom of expression. And sometimes they use the online platform to legitimize their critics and consolidate power. Sometimes they don't necessarily really restrict internet access, but they use those platforms to sort of consolidate their own power. A recent example is Ethiopia. This year, Ethiopia was under a 2 weeks government-imposed partial internet blackout. And there were large protests going on in the country, and the government decided that one way to deal with that was to shut down internet. So here's some of the facts that might be interesting to look at. 5 527 million, we have 527 million internet users in Africa right now. That is like a drop in the water compared to 5.8 billion global users. So that's not even half of Africa's population. So we already have a problem, getting the majority of our continent on internet. But even though we already have that as a challenge, internet shutdowns are really not helping digital penetration and digital grow on the African continent. The 39% internet penetration in Africa lags behind the 59% global average and 63% of the rest of the world, according to the Internet World Statistics. Where did internet shutdowns begin? So the first instance recorded was in 2007 in Guinea, when the government of Guinea decided that they'll switch off the internet during protests against the former president Lansana Conté. This is what is known as, the first major internet blackout. And since then, digital blackouts in Africa have become the norm during political upheaval and uncertainties. So the focus of this discussion today is on the study which was published early last year, which is titled Despots and Disruption. This is a study that was conducted by the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa. This organization promotes inclusive ICT policy in Africa. So they do a lot of work in this area, trying to understand what is going on, what our governments are doing. And one thing they said is that even though we've noticed what the governments are doing, they are becoming more open, acknowledging that internet shutdowns are a problem. And this is a step forward, although it doesn't necessarily fix the problem, but the fact that the governments are acknowledging what they are doing, it opens the door into transparency, into being able to understand what the motivations are. And also that gives civil society organizations and NGOs like the one that published this study material to sort of understand what's going on and give advice on how to move forward. So this study looked at 5 dimensions of internet shutdowns in Africa, but we're not going to cover all 5 dimensions in this discussion today. So they look at observations, they provide an observation on the shutdowns that took place between 2018 and early in 2019. And they also draw a link between the level of authoritarianism in a country and how long a president has been in power and the likelihood of experiencing a network shutdown. So they do a great job at looking at how long this president has been in power and does that influence their ability to impose an internet shutdown. And they also touch on the economic and social impact of these disruptions, because up until last year, a lot of the talk on internet shutdown focused on elections, focused on civil liberties, focused on how people are not able to express themselves. But it's interesting that now the studies are starting to look at the economic consequences of internet shutdowns. The big motivation that came out of this study is that elections. Governments use the excuse that people are going to spread misinformation, people are going to spread hate speech, and the only way to control that is to shut down the internet. And the same applies during protests. Generally, when people take to the streets, we see governments, scrambling to sort of control that. And one of the ways that they feel will help the situation is to completely just shut down the internet. But one thing I did not quite know prior to the talk today is that some countries, they decide to shut down the internet because of national exams. That was quite ridiculous, really, like Algeria, Ethiopia, and Mauritania. So when kids are writing exams, government will go ahead and shut down the internet, apparently, so that kids are not able to cheat. But I would say to a government like that, like, you really have to worry about your education system if the only way you can control kids not cheating in an exam is to shut down the internet. So that I found was a bit worrisome. But yeah, it is one of the reasons why they decide to shut down the internet. So looking at internet disruptions, as the study that I just mentioned talked about, the first thing that came up is internet disruptions are the preserve of Africa's most authoritarian states. So governments that are very controlling, that are very authoritarian, are the ones that are more likely to impose shutdown. And disruptions in the previous 3 years all show that the less democratic credentials a government possesses, the higher the likelihood that it will order internet disruptions. They looked at African countries, and all of the African countries that had disruption internet access in early 2019, those countries are categorized as authoritarian under the democracy index published by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So we can already tell that there's a certain tendency, there are certain ways that one can know a government disposition when it comes to internet shutdown. So that government is an authoritarian government. And of the 22 African countries where internet disruptions were recorded over the last 5 years, 77% are authoritarian, while 23% are like hybrid regimes. So it's important to also note that in certain places where we've seen internet shutdowns, not all of these countries were authoritarian. So there are different reasons why a government would decide to go with an internet shutdown. As I mentioned earlier, that sometimes they just do it because of exams, that so that kids will not cheat during an exam. And internet freedom predators also press freedom culprits that we've seen in Algeria, in Congo Brazzaville, in Burundi, in Cameroon, Central African Republic, the DR Congo, Chad. So the countries that are likely that in fact have imposed internet restrictions, these countries also appear to have the lowest ratings when it comes to press freedom. So we can already tell that for a government, for a president to decide to shut down the internet, that government, you can be sure that that government has already been doing the same when it comes to press freedom. They've been stifling the freedom of expression in different ways. So internet shutdown is just one of the expression of the authority authoritarian tendency to rule. So here you can look at different authoritarian regimes: Algeria, Burundi, Central African Republic, Cameroon, Chad, Congo Brazzaville, Democratic Republic of Congo. These countries have had repeated internet disruptions. In the Congo, for instance, we've had one in 2015, in 2018, in 2017, in 2019. So there's been a pattern of internet shutdowns observed in these specific countries, and they are also categorized as authoritarian regimes. In Algeria, there was in 2018 an internet shutdown for 3 hours each day during a national exam. So in Gabon, total shutdown followed a social media shutdown and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew, where starting at 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., nobody has access to internet access. So there are various ways in which these governments that you see on this image have used their authority and their power to just stifle the freedom of freedom of expression online. And then there are also hybrid regimes. As I said, not all governments that are known to be authoritarian are the only ones that have been implementing shutdowns, but also governments that, are not quite democratic, but they're sort of hybrid. Like the Gambia, Mali, Morocco, Sierra Leone, Uganda. So these governments have found different ways to reduce people's access to internet. Uganda, for instance, recently has introduced a social media tax where you have to pay a certain amount of money to use the internet space, and that in itself is one form of really stifling people's access to internet and just giving people the freedom that they need to express themselves, and even if it doesn't please the government. So these countries also, they're not necessarily those that are known to be authoritarian, but they've used internet disruption as a method to control people. And you have on this other side in green, these are flawed democracy, which include Botswana, Cape Verde, Ghana, Lesotho, Namibia, Senegal, South Africa. Internet shutdowns have not been observed in these specific countries. But again, there are different ways that the government in Senegal, for instance, will see down the line that the government doesn't shut down the internet, but they've been introducing certain controls as a way to have a surveillance, have control over what people are saying on social media. But as I'm up to now, in a partial or a full internet shutdown in these countries that appeared in green, known as flawed democracies. And then the full democracy is Mauritius. Also, this country has not seen any internet shutdown. The second point that the study made is that the longer a president is in power, the higher propensity to order shutdowns. So that link between the number of years that the current president is on power and have spent in power and internet shutdowns have been established. An example is the DR Congo. Joseph Kabila took over the presidency in 2001 following the death of his father, and he was the one that abused this, using the internet, shutting down the internet during very crucial moment in the country. And as we saw, there's been like over five internet shutdowns during the period where Joseph Kabila was president. Now we have a different president, but he was one of those that really abused his authority in controlling people's ability to express themselves online. In Gabon, Gabon has been governed by the Bongo family for over a century. Ali Bongo took power in 2009, but prior to that, his dad was president for 42 years. And so Gabon is also one of those countries that have seen repeated internet shutdowns. So you can see the longer people are in power, especially in places where there's sort of a legacy where dad was president and then the son took over in those countries. If you look closely, you will see that those countries are most likely to have internet shutdowns during elections or protests. Sudan is the same story. Omar al-Bashir has clocked 30 years in power, and Sudan has also experienced a number of these restrictions imposed on citizens in the internet, in the digital space. And Cameroon, same story. Again, it's the same pattern repeating itself, same patterns repeating themselves. 36 years in power, and Cameroon has seen a number of those restrictions. Also, as we go, please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, if you have a comment. You can raise your hand anytime and I will acknowledge you, and you can give us your contribution. And if you would like, we'd like to encourage you to open up your videos, because you can see yourself on camera. When this show is over, we're gonna publish it on YouTube, and you'll be able to go back and see how you contributed. So feel free to raise your hand at any point. You can use the raising hand function and in the chat room. There's somewhere where it says participants. If you click on that participant function, you will see the ability to raise your hand and contribute to today's conversation. So feel free to do that. So here's a picture. I mean, here's an image of some of the countries we just talked about. So the study called this a wall of shame, just showing, first of all, how long some of these presidents have been in power, and that these are the ones who were running with these internet shutdowns in Africa. As you can tell, we have in Equatorial Guinea, somebody who's been in power for 39 years, Paul Biya at 36, Congo Brazzaville, Denis Sassou Nguesso, 34 years. As you can see, that they've been in power for so long, and still these are the same people who are willing to just use their power and prevent people from expressing themselves. I see a hand raised. Abajo, yeah, you're welcome to contribute right now. Please tell us your thought on this. Abajo, can you hear me? Your mic is mute, so we're not able to hear you. Okay, so we'll get back to you. Just let us know when you are able to unmute yourself. Okay, so while that gets sorted, let us move on with our presentation. Yeah, so this is where, let me just make sure that I'm actually sharing. Share. Okay, so yeah, this is where we were looking at how these are some of the government that came up in the study as the one that have been culprits of internet shutdowns in Africa. You can see Burundi as well, Pierre Nkurunziza, all of them. Okay, Violet has a hand raised. I will get to you in a moment, Violet. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Gloria. Thank you very much for this presentation today. It's morning here, so this morning. I'm looking at the wall of shame, and I don't know if you can show it to us again or not, but so like you just discussed a few minutes ago that, there's a very high correlation between length of stay in power and internet shutdowns. And so I'm taking a look at the wall of shame, and something interesting. I'm looking at Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and he's been quite notorious for being an authoritarian president. And so it's interesting that for the last 18 years, he hasn't shut down the internet yet. And I'm just comparing him to his peers here, and I find that quite interesting. I don't know if for some reason, I don't know if you were able to find out why, but I thought that was interesting.
That's a very interesting point. And when I was doing my master thesis, when I was collecting data for my thesis, which looked at journalists and government relation between journalists in Africa and their government, that was based in the DRC. But there's something interesting that came up when I was interviewing journalists in the Congo. So some of them told me that even though Congo has had internet shutdowns and also has a very low ranking when it comes to press freedom, Rwanda has been very slick about it.
Right.
So Kagame hasn't gone full out and imposed an internet shutdowns, but there are ways that they're doing it without being explicit. Right. It's like Uganda imposing a social tax. You know for sure that there will be people who won't be able to read, to have access to internet when you put something like that in place. So I would say there's different ways that the Rwandan government have been able to control communication without being explicit about it. Yeah. So there are certain restrictions, certain things you cannot say, or if you say something that the government is going to track you down. There have been journalists who have been tracked down, journalists who have been stifled. Like when I was interviewing journalists in the Congo, they'll tell me sometimes they don't, it's not done in the open. There's one specific journalist who was doing a very critical political show on TV. He told me, I got calls from the government so many times. They tell me, if you don't stop, we're going to do this. If you don't, I actually directly spoke to two journalists who told me I had to stop with my show because I was getting calls from the government telling me that they will kill me, they will come after me. So those are some of the ways that they do it underground. That's what I would say.
I'm glad you mentioned more slicker ways to impose, you know, to curtail freedom of speech. And that reminded me of a recent article that I read. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hotel Rwanda movie. That was such a big hit. Yes. And apparently the lead actor or someone was arrested and detained.
Oh, yes.
Movie. And I'm like, but it was just a movie and it's been years ago and you're just arresting the person right now. So I agree with you being slick about it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Peter has a hand raised. Peter, you can go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Hold on one moment. Let me turn off that. So one of the things that I notice here about this wall of shame is that some of these people here on the wall of shame are no longer on this wall. In terms of, for example, Omar al-Bashir, as well as the, let me see this, Bouteflika in Algeria is not here. And obviously Pierre Nkurunziza died not too long ago.
Yes.
But in the case of Omar al-Bashir and Bouteflika, what was kind of interesting was they all underwent these social revolution of sorts, right? Where people were taking to the internet and were using it as a platform for mobilization in their country in large-scale protests. So one of the things I'm curious to hear your perspective on is this sort of implementation of these internet shutdowns, not those other means you're talking about in Rwanda where it's a bit more subtle, but these internet shutdowns, are they sort of a latched in control power, and are they perceived as such by those citizens in the country, right? Because I can imagine those citizens in the country, when they see the government is shutting down the internet, they may feel empowered that this is working out, and that may encourage them more and find more innovative ways of getting around it, of doing it, such that we see at least two of these members here have fallen to mass protests, not just a sort of a movement or a palace coup, but mass protest against their leadership, their longtime leadership. So I'm curious what you think. Does it actually, is it a strategy that can backfire and actually encourage people to mobilize even more on the internet when they take such a drastic step?
Oh, totally. I personally believe it just backfires. The more they do it, the more fired up the people become. And I think I was talking to my sister, a friend who's based in Africa. They already know what to do when they shut down the internet. They know that they can use VPNs, they'll use different methods. So although we know that these internet shutdowns have an impact, but there still are ways. People have developed tools and strategies to still be able to come together and mobilize even when governments impose these shutdowns. So although they restrict freedom of expression to a certain extent, they do not restrict people fully. And so as technology evolve, as technology continue to penetrate in Africa, there will come a time where more people will have access to sophisticated tools, to different kinds of virtual private networks where, imposing these shutdowns would just be pointless. But I have to say that studies are also revealing that governments are also becoming sophisticated in the ways they're using their tools and surveillance methods. So, I mean, you cannot. I always believe that you cannot bury the will of the people just by these internet shutdowns. So they work and they don't work at the same time. That's my personal view. I don't know if somebody has a different opinion on that. I think I saw Eva's hand raised as well. Eva, do you still have a comment?
Yes, I want to talk about something briefly. Right, that was a good presentation, and thank you. So what I want to say is that, countries that are not using internet shutdown, the government are also finding creative ways to monitor people's online activity. I know, for instance, in Ghana, like there are some of the political parties has like some social media soldiers or something like that are trolling people, that are following people, and also posting all sorts of information out there. So it's also something that they are trying to do. And also, we are also in the age of misinformation where if they don't shut down the internet and there's something that comes on the internet that, like, say, criticize what they are doing, they come up with an alternative. You get it? So these are like strategies, because most countries feels like, or some of the leaders feel like, shutting internet will create certain image to them, right? As Peter was just shared in the box, that in Ghana they were discussing about internet shutdown during election, but they decided against it because Ghana is not known to be this kind of it's not known for a country that use heavy-handed tactics. So what do? They rather straw people, monitor people's internet activities, right? And send them warning, you should desist from posting this and things like that. Sometimes that is what they send to them, like secret. You'll be there, you'll be posting something against the government. By the time you realize, someone will send your internet, stop posting these things. If you don't stop posting it, we will do this to you. So they threaten people for, speaking against the government. So instead of shutting the internet, they're also using these creative means to shut down people's voices. So these are some of the things that people are using. And us, I don't know if you already shared, I came in a little bit late, about also in Uganda, what the government is using by using internet taxes and social media tax to restrict people's internet access. So these are some of the creative ways, as you already shared, that a time will come that it will be difficult for them to, monitor restrict people's internet access because of certificated mobile phone devices and other internet accesses that people will have. So even if they shut it down, people will also find ways and means to connect to the internet. Actually, people are doing it already. So they are trying to find creative ways, to shut people's to shut people from sharing their views. And this has been going on where they monitor people and try to spread disinformation or send you a strong warning that if you don't stop, they will actually so these are some of the things. And I have a question. My question is that if you look at the wall of shame, you will tell that a lot of countries, a lot of leaders here have, like, say, leverage in terms of have power in shutting down their internet. Does this mean that the telecommunication industry is owned by the government, is being controlled by the government? Because a place like Ghana, like this, I know that the telecommunication industry is private owned. So I don't know if there is any correlation between state-owned and private-owned telecommunication and the impact it has on internet shutdown. Because if it's private, the government has to go through a lot of procedures to be able to shut it down. But if it's public, it's easy for, let's say, Yoseveni to make just a phone call to tell them to shut it down. So what do you think?
I didn't really go deep into looking at that very important correlation between private and public telecom companies. But one thing that came up in my research is that telecom companies, even private ones, they are not willing to release transparency reports. That's the one thing that was observed, as opposed to like the giants like the Facebook, the Googles, and the Twitters. Those are more likely, especially like in America and in Europe, they're more likely to release transparent reports and showing what the user rights are and what are the methods they're implementing to sort of promote user privacy. But back in our continent, that's not the case. Very few telecom companies are releasing those transparency reports. So it's even difficult to tell whether it's the government, that relationship between the government and telecom companies, to sort of trace the kind of communication that happens between the two, if the governments are paying these telecom companies for the shutdowns. Because there's the lack of transparency, it's hard to know what's going on, what the relationship between government and telecom companies are. So there are very few companies. I think Vodafone was one of those that were mentioned that is starting to release transparency reports for people to sort of be able to tell what the company is doing and how they're navigating some of these very sensitive issues. But the majority of telecoms on the African continent, they are not at that stage yet where they can fully disclose their operations. So that will be interesting, and that maybe will be able to tell us if the government is paying these telecom companies for these shutdowns. It'll be interesting to look more into that. Also, as Peter correctly mentioned, some presidents are no longer on this wall of shame. Kabila has not been president for over a year now, so a lot has changed, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Maybe next year, when a study like this is published, we'll see new faces. But this was published in March of 2019, so that's why some of them, are no longer here. So what are the high costs of internet shutdowns? So outside of the fact that politically, people are not able to engage freely without access to internet, but also economically, what are some of the costs? So the study reveals that network disruptions lead to direct loss in earnings in terms of the ICT sector. And also these government disruptions are resulting in the loss of cost savings by businesses that are deprived of internet access. A lot of businesses already are starting to rely on the internet. I mentioned the mobile money transfer applications that are relying on internet that have been very successful in some part of Africa. People can easily send money to a friend, to a family member. And so when internet is shut down, so many of these businesses really are deprived. And so that leads to a loss of savings for so many of the businesses. And also, even though some of these shutdowns are short-lived, recently in Ethiopia, it was a 2-week shutdown. Sometimes it's just a 1 week or 5 days, but the impact and the consequences, they go beyond the period in which that disruption happened. And so another thing is that these disruptions undermine investor confidence. They raise a reputational risk and are so detrimental to foreign direct investment. There are certain countries in Africa that are just high risk, and investors would not want to go there because there's just so many risks. And these internet shutdowns are not helping, are not attracting investment at all. So these are some of the things our leaders should start thinking about, that this is not just about them winning an election. This is really crippling the country economy. So this was an estimate that looked at 5 different countries: Ethiopia, Chad, DR Congo, Cameroon, and Mali. And so they looked at these 5 countries and did an estimate over a 5-day period of shutdown, and the amount of money that these countries would lose if they were implementing a 5-day total shutdown is $65 million. So again, this was one of the ways that we can see that our economy, so many countries are suffering from internet shutdowns, and this is beyond elections. This is beyond people's ability to express themselves, to support their favorite political parties, but businesses are suffering, and nobody's winning, when these internet shutdowns are applied. So a few other things to sort of point out regarding this is that the countries that have ordered shutdowns, they also dominate the top risk ranks. As I mentioned, some of these countries are already high on risk when it comes to investment, when it comes to businesses. They're already high there. And so the more they implement these shutdowns, just they're increasing their own risk. And also I mentioned at the beginning that Africa still has a problem of internet penetration. There are many parts of Africa where people still do not have access to internet. And so when very few people have access to internet, and you take those very few people, you impose those restrictions on them, you're just like undermining the internet uptake most in regions of Africa where access and affordability are still a big challenge. And so we also see that the countries that disrupt internet access, they have the lowest internet usage figures. So internet penetration, countries that have an internet penetration of less than 20%, those countries are most likely to disrupt the internet during protest. And as of early 2018, that's when this study was being conducted. At the beginning, all countries where an internet disruption was ordered, the ruling party had been in power for 18 years on average. We just looked at the wall of shame. We could tell the number of years that some of these governments have spent in power. So again, that link between being in power way too long and, you know, feeling free to just impose an internet shutdown. We have some positive examples. I know all of this can be gloomy, can kind of what's going on in our world, but there are a few examples, even though these are very, very isolated instances, but we can look at some of these countries and learn from how they've dealt with protests and those very sensitive moments in their countries. The Nigeria's Office of National Security Advisor, this was during the recent election, where they released a statement because the public was, fearing that they're gonna be victims of another shutdown like neighboring countries. But this office released a statement saying that shutting down the internet is akin to shutting down national development and security. And that is very true. There's so many things that can be said about Nigeria, but internet shutdown have not been one of the issues that this country has dealt with. As we can see right now, the major protest that is going on to end SARS's anti-robbery squad, but people are able to use internet to protest. So that is at least one way that the Nigerian government sort of have not been like the other governments that we've seen on the wall of shame. In Ghana has also had a positive example when it comes to internet shutdown. That was in December 2019, ahead of the elections. Then President John Dramani also said that social media would not be shut down. Instead, the government worked with police, worked with civil society organizations to use social media and push information about the elections, and also address some of the worries and the queries that people had. So they did a pretty good job using internet the way it's supposed to be used, to inform people during an election and not to restrict them. And also in Kenya in 2017, Kenya followed suit in announcing that internet will remain accessible during elections. And indeed, internet was accessible during that 2017 election in Kenya. Senegal has never experienced an internet shutdown. However, the government appears to be tightening it. Don't doing openly, but they have different ways that they tighten that online communication. So that's all I had for today. There's so much that we can discuss about this important issue of digital democracy in Africa, but this is everything that I had prepared. But I want us to discuss people who are connected right now. Have you experienced a form of internet restriction in your country? What did it look like? As I said, internet restriction is not always very obvious, but there are certain ways that make us think that, no, this is not right. Have you had any experience like that, and what has been the impact? We would love to hear from our participants. Violet's hand is raised. Violet, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gloria. This has really been very enlightening. Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful presentation. And I love how you touched, so many aspects of digital suppression or freedom of speech and expression on the continent. And in fact, it has me wondering about, the trajectory of democracy on the continent as a whole, because as much as we observe that as governments become sleeker, populations also becoming sleeker, and then governments also become even more sleeker. And I'm like, okay, so this cat and mouse game, where does it end in terms of democracy on the continent? But yes, I have experienced internet shutdown. My voice. So in February 2016, we did have, pardon my voice. Excuse me. So in February 2016, yeah, like you mentioned, we did have the government cut off access, to Twitter, to Facebook, WhatsApp, and even mobile money apps during the 2016 elections. And that was in an attempt to stem information flow. And I mean, being in the middle of what was happening at that time. I mean, no one expected that there would be an internet shutdown. That was one. And then two, they did shut down mobile money. So at that point in time, they were counting votes. Other polling stations were, returning results and things like that. So we did have certain radio stations that were also broadcasting results in real time. And so people were sort of like checking results against what the Electoral Commission was giving out. And we did have those radio stations shut down as well. But this crippled a lot of things because, for one, I mean, well, there have always been allegations of election rigging in Uganda. That's not new. And again, that case went into court. But because there was that disruption in the flow of information, it became very hard to track what exactly was going on. So if, for example, there was, okay, that's a stretch, but imagine there was a revolution that would have taken place because maybe people were like, okay, we can't do this anymore. We're tired of election rigging, or we don't like the way things are going. It was hard to mobilize because, one, you didn't know what was going on anywhere. And even if there was any kind of unrest, you wouldn't be able to communicate. So that worked well for the government, but it didn't work well for the citizens because no one knew what was going on anywhere. It was literally a blackout. And then two, because they had shut down mobile money, again, it hurts mobilization. You're not going to be able to send money over to colleagues in the struggle. That's if you're in any kind of struggle. So as much as at the time it was hard to quantify how exactly, deeply the impact went, you could clearly see it. And on top of disrupting the flow of information, it also created some kind of fear, and the government loomed large over the population because we begin to think, okay, the government has so much power, there's nothing we can do at this point. And so it did hurt democracy a lot. So we do have another election coming up in next year, early next year. And so it's left to be seen if, again, they're going to shut down the internet. Although we are looking forward to it, it's not something that we don't think can't happen anymore, because again, when the president was being sworn in, I think, again, they cut access to social media. And right now, we did have the government announce some sort of social media policy that was supposed to go into effect on October 5th, where you just couldn't post anything online without seeking permission. And I think they had to sort of like audit whatever it is that you wanted to say online before you could say it, because right now with the pandemic that's going on, physical campaigns have been suspended and everything has been, directed to go online because they want to keep the infection rates down, which does make sense. However, because of that, most opposition politicians can't get airtime on radios because apparently the government bought all the airtime until election time, and then now social media is being restricted. So it's like the government is getting ahead of its game, restrict freedom of speech on social media, and then maybe later clamp down and enact a total shutdown. We don't know, but it remains to see exactly the impact, but it's huge.
Yeah, as you said, it's really hard to measure the impact right away because there's just so many levels and aspects of the internet divide and challenges in Africa. So we look forward to see what happens in the next election. Peter?
Right.
So my comment, I just want to echo something that was said in the chat earlier by Pascal. Maybe you can touch on this question, and then I got my own comment. He says, has any study been commissioned to establish the effectiveness of actions against the targeted subjects? Do these internet shutdowns really work? So I'm curious to hear your thought on that. I think you alluded to that when you talked about the fact that there are VPNs or other ways in which people get around it. But at the same time, Violet suggested that it really does hamper efforts, right? It is to some degree effective on tamping down mobilization, constraining information. So I'm curious where you come down on that issue. My other comment, and I'm curious your reaction to it, is that I'm curious about how unpopular or popular internet shutdowns really are. right? From the perspective of your talk, you sort of emphasize the fact that, you know, there are these people in power, particularly these political elites, right? That wall of shame we were discussing, that are tamping down on dissent and repressing their populace. But how many people are also on their side, also sympathize with the need for limiting the internet, limiting information flows in these critical times, because they themselves feel as if they are an extension of the government themselves. So I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the government supporters, those who, you know, wanted Kabila to stay in power or wanted Omar al-Bashir. I can imagine that they're going to be a little bit more positive about that. But at the same time, you presented the economic losses and the disruptions that occur, right? So I'm really curious to know, where do citizens come down on this? It's clear that the opposition is going to be concerned, but the government supporters, are they saying, I'm going to put up with this for a certain period of time? Or are they also saying, I'm not so sure that this is the best technique because I'm concerned about my business, my other communication sort of portfolio that I have, and my international connections that I may need to maintain? So I'm really curious about how the reaction to these internet shutdowns may differ based on your position, particularly your political positionality, given that you've emphasized that elections and protests are sort of the key drivers of internet shutdowns.
Those are two important points that you made, Peter, and also Pascal's comment is very interesting comment. I've not come across a study that actually studies how effective these government shutdowns are. I've not seen, really, to be honest. I hope that we, you know, going forward, we'll see studies looking into that, because it's really hard to tell what these shutdowns accomplish at the end of the day. You know, outside of the economic loss, which is obvious because a lot of businesses rely on internet, but when it's imposed just for people not to talk about politics, I really don't know how effective that is. I would love to know myself. I would look into that further. And on Peter's comment, personally, I've not come across any person who's excited about their internet being shut down. I've not seen one. But again, you make an important point that there are people who are close to the government. Outside of people who are directly involved with the president, people who are part of the president cabinet, I've not heard a person justify a shutdown of an internet, especially during a very sensitive moment like a protest, like elections. Anything can happen. You need to be able to be in touch with your family. Let's say you went to a protest and something happened, and then you're not able to communicate with anybody. I know in the Congo, of course, he was the Minister of Communication. He was the spokesperson of shutting down the internet, explain why it's important so that people don't share false information. Because usually that's what they say, that people will not share information that is not real. But you know, we know that the intention is deeper than that, and I doubt that an average citizen would enjoy internet shutdown. And people who are on the government side, they probably have other methods of communication. I am pretty sure they have their own VPN. You know, probably this internet shutdown doesn't even affect them. These are people with money, or either they're connected politically somehow. So, you know, they can only motivate what works for them. They can only motivate their interest. But for the average citizen, the person who's actually affected by this, I don't think anybody enjoys this. That's my opinion. But it'll be interesting to see if, let's say, a president supporter, how they feel about the internet being shut down. So it'll be interesting to know. Eva has a hand raised.
One of the things I was thinking about is that some of us may not have experienced internet shutdown, but we have experienced something that prevents us from using the internet. That is blackouts, like when the power supply cuts, like the lights suddenly go off, everything is shut down. You know, that affects also how we use the internet. For instance, I remember when I was in Ghana in 2015, the light was just going off. I couldn't even take an online class because I don't have constant supply of electricity. So this also restricts, your access to internet. People may agree or disagree with me. They may think that, oh, you have your mobile phone, but imagine if the light is going on for prolonged hours, your phone battery may die, and then you can't be able to charge it. In that case, your access to internet is also restricted. And I think some governments are also using this creative means. Instead of targeting internet shutdown, they actually target the power supply. Do you get it? So if you do have limited power supply, you may choose to have a generator that comes to you with an extra cost, but in spite of that, you still are restricted when the internet, when it's connected to power supply, power cut, and things like that. So that was how I was thinking about it. I was thinking about like the doomsaw. Doomsaw is like power cut or blackout in Ghana. At a point, it was just going on like 24 hours. You do not have a light. And how do you access electricity without, how do you access the internet if you don't have light for like electricity for 24 hours? That also restricts your internet access. So like these are like some of the ways that I have been thinking about it that I feel like has impacted my internet use.
That's a very valid point, Eva. And we know electricity, access to power is a major issue in many parts of Africa. So it could very well be that the government was just, just decide to use that instead of just going straight to the internet and telecom companies. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, Gloria. Whether, just building on what Eva said, whether there's a substitute between, fluctuating browning out or load shedding of power as a substitute for cutting the internet, and say, well, we're not cutting the internet, we're not restricting, but there was high usage, and we're under a little bit of pressure right now. So I'm curious to know whether there are other sort of substitutes, because you've already alluded to the fact that there are different levers the government can use other than just a shutdown. So it's an interesting point to see. I think in Cameroon, that would be one case we'd have to investigate quite a lot, because they had a whole region of the country that was without internet for a period of time. And I think they also meddled with the power as well at some point, in some parts of the Anglophone, the English speaking parts of Cameroon. So it's an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to consider that, like you said, especially in Cameroon. Cameroon has had a lot of challenges with Paul B in the last years. I mean, there's very different aspects of restrictions in Cameroon that we could look at. So, yeah, I don't know, but I would say that because people have become so used to electricity blackouts, so people have alternatives. People are using generators, people are using solar panels. I mean, we're talking about the middle class, but I don't know what else, what of go around that issue of electricity blackout. So Violet has a hand raised, but before you ask your question, I want us to also look at this. The second question, what can be done? Because that's another issue. Yes, we know that this is a problem, but what are some of the solutions, some of the ways that we can address this problem? So Violet, you start.
Well, thank you, Gloria. Well, I didn't have a question the first time, but as just, following up from what Peter said, and Eva, that, maybe shutting down power could be a substitute to shutting down the internet, because if you don't have battery power on your phone, because for most Africans, they access the internet through their mobile devices, how are you going to access the internet? So you'll just think power went off and not the internet. So you're less likely to blame the government or become suspicious. And then it just has me thinking about how, again, when I think it was Gloria or Eva who mentioned something about some people being able to access generators, then it just had me thinking about how there's levels to this kind of oppression. So if you think about socioeconomic levels, so for someone who has more money and maybe than the middle class, Gloria, as you said, they might be able to, have generators and have a backup plan for their power. So what happens to someone else who doesn't have that level of access? So again, even when it comes to using VPN, most of those apps take up a lot of data. So you need to have much more money to be able to buy, more bundles. So it just shows you how, depending on your socioeconomic levels, you might experience higher levels of oppression, digital oppression, compared to someone with access. So about what could be done, well, to be honest with you, it feels like, for me, I feel like it has a lot to do with the kind of leadership that we choose to elect. Well, I understand for certain countries, they don't really have much choice in who becomes president. I get it. But I mean, most of these leaders came in as elected leaders, and then eventually they changed and became something else. So, because I mean, think about it, if it doesn't start from political will and our leaders becoming, more willing to, switch from being president to something else, or at least allow for power transition, things are not going to change. Because if you look at our wall of shame, for example, all these people are people who want to have a hold on power. So someone comes in as an elected leader and then they want to turn the presidency into a monarchy or something like that. So if we do not get back to political will, allowing ourselves to become democracies, I think we're going to be fighting this war for a very long time, because no matter what citizens do, no matter how much we develop sophisticated systems to get around this, it's not going to go away. So, and I know, of course, definitely, as human beings, we do have a specific time we can be alive. So these leaders are eventually going to die out. So the people who come in, what are their mindsets like? Will they be willing to, have a different view to power and leadership? So I think it begins changing the trajectory of how our leaders think.
Yeah. I cannot agree with you more. Our leaders, the problem is sometimes we don't get to choose our leaders. That is the main problem in Africa. Elections are just it's just a formality, but whoever gets into power is already been decided. So that's a tragedy. Eva?
So I was just thinking about the fact that what can be done. We have to protest, because I just feel like protest has become like the key to tell the government how dissatisfied we are with certain services in the country. And I remember that in Ghana, I think in 2016, 16 election, before the election, people actually went on the streets to protest against the doomsday, like the blackout. And it was so well attended that the government has to respond within the shortest time, which meant going to borrow money to come up with a substitute to supply electricity. And it worked, and we are here in 2020. And though there is blackouts, but it has not been as frequent as it was like 5 or 6 years ago, So I just feel like in Africa right now, our leaders are stubborn. Like, as one of our presidents said, that he has a goat syndrome, goat. So, goat are very stubborn. And that I just feel like protest has become the tool that a lot of people are using to tell government about things they need change. Like, look at what happened in Nigeria just this past weekend, and the SARS. And within 2 days or 3 days, the government said, we've ended it. So I think that probably much is not being done about the internet shutdown, because we the citizens have become satisfied, and also because we have created ways and means to get around the internet, like as you said, VPN. So we are like, okay, they can take the internet. We can still have access to internet through other means. But imagine there are no other means. Imagine you do not have those other means.
Yes.
And you are like, this is so bad. You take to the street to ensure that it is done. So for me personally, I think now our leaders on the continent are so stubborn. They don't listen to the citizens. During election time, they come to us like saints, angels, promising us big time. But after election, they're like the devil incarnate. So, and the only thing that can stop them is when we take on the street. That is the only thing they understand. Like being very vocal, aggressive about the issue and protesting. That is the only way things get done on the continent. And you can see in Nigeria, Sudan, and other places. So I just feel like if we become angry enough, we agonize and become angry enough, they will stop it.
Yeah, protests do work. Already they worked in a couple countries, so we need to keep the pressure up. Jalili has a hand raised.
That was a very brilliant presentation. That was a very brilliant presentation. But my concern is about the issue of protests in Africa. Particularly when I look at the protests that is going on in Nigeria, I feel that protests sometimes can be hijacked by very mischievous elements. Myself, I'm a product of protest in many different ways. I've led protests. People have died beside me during protests as a result of police brutality. I could remember when I was a student back at the University of Lagos, some students came into the campus that somebody was shot, and this guy was a cultist. Before we know, we mobilized about 20 buses full of students, to revenge on the police folks. At the end of the day, one of us was killed. It was 3 years down the line that we realized that it was misinformation that actually led to the protest. So this being one of my concerns with protests in Africa, that protests actually leading to the achievement of the intended objective. And I also understand that protests can easily be hijacked, by very mischievous elements, just like in the case of Nigeria today. A lot of those folks on the street are criminals, they're yahoos, a lot of them are cultists, Of course, there are very good ones among them, but majority of those out there, they are cultists. So this is one of my concerns about the use of protests, to even cause disruption. Protests should, for no reason, lead to economic disruption, because that is infringing on the right of other people. Those of us that have elected to protest, we have the right to the street. Our right does not necessarily lead to, constraining the right of other people to go about their normal businesses. Just like we've been talking about the issue of internet disruption. These are some of my concerns about protests in Africa. And I don't think that protests can actually lead to the issue of addressing the issue of internet security, because internet now is gone beyond the issue of mode of communication. Internet is now an issue of national security.
Yes.
And it has gone beyond what we used to think about it. People are using it to chat. The moment something is enrolled as one of national security, the government will naturally be sensitive about it for many reasons. And in the foreseeable future, I am beginning to see that even in advanced democracy, there will be some element of issues of moderation pertaining to the use of internet. Like, for example, when you look at the election that Trump defeated Hillary, there was this issue of manipulation of the voters in the United States by Russian agents, by agent of guys from Russia. That's an issue of national security. Countries have been, talking enormously about issues of interference in their national affairs through manipulations of the internet and etc., etc. These are substantive issues of national security. So for whatever reasons, I am beginning to think that countries, leadership across the world, government across the world will be more sensitive about the issue of internet. If 5, 6 years ago, there wasn't a lot of noise about government having to regulate social media, but now social media are used as instrument of blackmail. And when somebody begins to blackmail somebody, libel all sort of issues in the internet, because nobody is actually policing it, then it becomes a tool of chaos. So I'm beginning to think that going forward, government will begin to leverage some of these reasons and to engage that conversation about the fact that there needs to be some level of control over the use of internet. And some of those reasons might, be instrumented to justify reasons why they have to shut down internet for whatever reason, what have you. So yeah, and so as we go forward, we begin to see a lot of things because whatever happens on the internet also affects the well-being of people, and that well-being can be interpreted in multifaceted ways. I
Okay.
also think that government will be leveraging such things, as one of the reasons why they possibly want to shut down the internet in different parts of the world. I believe it's an evolving thing, and it's going to generate a lot of interesting conversation. Just like the use of the social media is generating a lot of conversation. But you look at the issue of fake news.
Yes.
The way people spread fake news across the world is just through the use of, because internet made it possible. Internet, some people they've lost fortune to fake news. Some people they've lost hope to fake news. Some people have even died because of fake news.
Yeah, so
It's
many valid
also,
points there,
yeah,
Jalili.
yeah,
So many to dig in. Oh, you have to keep going. We're running out of time.
yeah, no problem.
I like that you brought up the national security because national security is basically like a top issue in in every country, and that's why internet will always be a problem because government will always want to have control. So that is one very important angle to look from. Amanda, I don't know if Amanda is still around and she wants to contribute. I know she had a hand raised. Is Amanda still around? All right. It looks like no, yeah, it looks like Amanda is gone. But thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. This was amazing. We will never complete this conversation. We can go on and on. There's a lot to discuss about technology. And we hope in some time in the near future we can come back to this issue and look at different angles as well. But for today, this is it for Hangout today. We have a very interesting topic coming up in 2 weeks. Please do not miss that. I hope you are not going to miss that. We are going to talk about the perspective of Africans when it comes to elections in the US. In 2 weeks' time, we will be like a week closer to the US election. And here at Leaders of Africa, we would love to hear from you in Africa. What is your perspective on what has been going on in the United States, especially now that elections are coming? And we will send out the link. Please keep an eye out on our social media platforms. We'll send all the details, but remember, it's in 2 weeks' time. All right, from me, thank you very much for hanging out with me and everyone else at Leaders of Africa today. It was a pleasure hearing from all of you. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and have a good day.